We have close to around 12 million people entering the workforce every year. The skill development problem cannot be solved by the government alone or neither by the industry alone.
Many of them are school leavers, college leavers. They need jobs and they're ideally suitable for entry-level jobs. To train them and put them in jobs, all the partner stakeholders need to work together.
मैंने सोचा कि बहुत अच्छा मौका मिला है मुझे क्योंकि ये बिल्कुल फ्री है। ये मेरा फर्स्ट स्टेप है क्योंकि मेरा बचपन से ही सपना रहा है कि मैं डॉक्टर बनूं।
The choice of schools available to low-income families is not nearly as good as the choices available to those wealthier families.
The reality is that the choice of a world-class neighborhood school within safe walking distance of my home was snatched from me.
As education privatization increased, African American students were increasingly segregated into low-income and uniracial schools, due both to an increase in charter schools and to public school closures.
부터 그런 혜택을 받았다고 할 수 있어요. 환경의 영향인 것 같아요. 본인이 욕심이 있고 또 어떻게 성취하고 싶은 목적이 있다면은 더 원하게 되는 경향이 생기는 것 같습니다. 이게 공교육이 꼭 부족해서라기보다는 여기서 좀 더 잘하고 싶다는 경쟁 의식.
A minha maior preocupação quando eu decidi me formar em recursos humanos utilizando o FIES já foi como eu pagaria. É muito assustador você ter ideia de que você está fazendo um curso para pagar ele depois de 2 anos ali no contrato, sendo que você não tem certeza de que você vai arrumar um emprego dali 2 anos.
Ndi mukyala muzadde nina abaana 6 nezijjayo ssente netwala abaana ku masomero ne babeera nga basoma nga nze bwe nnoonya emirimu gye nkolakola okusobola okusasula ssente z'okuzizzaayo.
Government of Uganda is not financing universal primary education or universal secondary education as it is supposed to. Education is a public good which government should try as much as possible to ensure that each and every person or child gets the opportunity to access.
We should be reimagining public education, having conversations in neighborhoods all over the country.
Daqui a alguns anos, eu espero realmente que no Brasil as pessoas que não tenham dinheiro para cursar em uma universidade privada ou para pagar o curso, ou realmente precisar investir muito em educação no Brasil, elas tenham mais acesso.
Hello and welcome to the global launch of the 2021-2022 Global Education Monitoring Report, Non-State Actors in Education, Who Chooses, Who Loses. Just a few housekeeping points before I introduce myself. Today's event is available to follow in English, Spanish, French and Arabic. And the report's hashtag, which should be somewhere on the screen, Write the Rules, is available to join the discussion and for you to react to the findings you hear today. Now, before I start, I just want to say a little bit about myself. My name is Fiona Miller and I will be moderating this discussion. I'm a British journalist and I write a lot about education and particularly about the difference between the state and the private system here. And so this report was fascinating for me to read because it does expand that issue into a global context and also helps us to think about some of the questions we need to understand if we're going to achieve equality and quality education for all. We're going to hear from ministers and experts representing a range of stakeholders, both governmental and non-governmental, and this will reflect the recommendations of the report. But before we start, I want to introduce our first speaker, who is the UNESCO Assistant Director General for Education, Stefania Giannini.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to welcome you today to the global launch of UNESCO's flagship education publication, the Global Education Monitoring Report. Alongside its review of progress towards SDG 4, including emerging evidence on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the report provides a global analysis of non-state actors in education. The significance of today's report cannot be understated. There is no part of education in which non-state actors are actually involved. Put it simply, without non-state actors, the education of 350 million more children would fall on the responsibility of the state. They look after the youngest children, develop textbooks, transport children to school, put food in their canteens, develop skills after young people leave school, and much, much more. Well, the report provides a timely contribution to policymakers worldwide who look for guidance in the new education landscape in the middle of the global pandemic, during which the non-state actor has played a prominent role. Governments committed in 2015, as we know, to provide 1 year of free pre-primary and 12 years of free primary and secondary education. However, the report clearly shows that education is costly for families. They account for 30% of total education spending in the world, which has the potential to contribute to more inequality in education opportunities and outcomes. Having said that, with this thought in mind, the report's recommendations were framed to help write the rules to ensure that equity in education is protected in financing, quality, governance, innovation, and policymaking. The aim is to harness the contribution that non-state actors can make to help governments achieve their agenda and find innovative solutions that can build inclusive education systems for all learners. We will hear today more about the recommendations from Manos, the director of the report, in just a moment. As lead agency for coordinating SDG 4, the guardian of SDG 4, so to say, we recognize at UNESCO the importance of engaging non-state actors to achieve our development goals as spelled out in the framework for action. The new UNESCO Futures of Education report, just released at the General Conference of UNESCO this year, proposes actually a new social contract built on a holistic sector view of education, embracing state and non-state actors working together towards a shared goal, a shared vision, and a common agenda. The launch of the new Global Education Monitoring Report this year provides a critical moment for all of us to reflect on common parameters, principles, to ensure that all education actors support progress towards SDG 4 and the fulfillment of the right to education, which is the real priority for all of us. Over the next 45 minutes, more or less, we'll hear from education experts, policymakers, working to make the most of state and non-state actors' contributions to deliver education of quality, but not at the cost of inequality. I cannot think of a timelier and more topical discussion to be having with you all today.
Well, thank you very much, Stefania. I think you've summed up the importance of this report, and I don't think I can do any more now other than to hand over to Manos Antoninis, who's going to tell us what's actually in it, some of the facts, and expose some of the myths and the recommendations and the questions we may want to probe later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, Stefania. Dear colleagues, thank you very much for joining us today at the launch of the Global Education Monitoring Report. Thank you all for joining this launch from wherever you are. Let me share my screen and start by basically reminding everyone how important this topic is. The framework for action, which is our roadmap for achieving SDG 4, highlighted the crucial role of non-state actors in education when it said that the ambitious education goal cannot be achieved by governments alone. Yet despite this understanding that fulfilling the right to education requires multiple stakeholders, non-state involvement in education generates passionate debate, particularly over two key concepts: the extent to which education is a public or a private good, a form of investment or consumption, and how to interpret the right to education with respect to its implications for state and non-state actors' responsibilities. Arguments regarding efficiency, innovation, and equity are at the core of the debates on the role of non-state actors in education, which are usually characterized by acrimony and mistrust, two very different views of the word clash, and it is rare to see agreement, compromise, or admission of error. Civil society organizations, teacher unions, public agencies, international organizations, businesses and their associations, NGOs, media, philanthropic foundations, political parties, academics, and think tanks are among those trying to shape the discourse and influence opinion in favor of or against a stronger role for non-state actors. The report's rallying call, "Who chooses, who loses?" invites policymakers to question relationships with non-state actors in terms of fundamental choices between equity and freedom of choice, the two pillars of the right to education, between encouraging initiative and setting standards, between groups of varying means and needs, between immediate commitments under SDG 4 and those to be progressively realized, between education and other social sectors. The report urges governments to see all institutions, students, and teachers as part of a single system. With that in mind, one of the first things we did in this report was precisely to look at what the general public opinion feels about the role of public education. And we found that 9 in 10 people in 34 middle and high income countries, the first study of this kind to have a global reach, found that 90% of people said that primary responsibility for providing school education rested with governments. Although you do see that in a country like India, just half of the people share this opinion. And indeed, we will be dedicating our regional report on non-state actors in South Asia precisely to look at this phenomenon. The report, as you already heard, is trying to question a number of myths that really dominate this debate. The first is that state and non-state actors can be clearly distinguished. Non-state actors engage for multiple reasons, in fact, in various arrangements in the relationship with the state, with a range of costs. We found that in the vast majority of countries, there are government-aided non-state schools. The second myth is that the role of the non-state involvement is known. In fact, we know that 19% of primary school-age children and 27% of secondary school-age children are enrolled in private institutions. But the involvement of non-state actors comes in many different shapes and sizes at all levels of education, from early childhood to adulthood. The third myth is that public education is equitable. In fact, it is not. Households face huge costs for educating their children. In low and lower middle income countries, they account for 39% of total spending. About 8% of households have to borrow for education, 12% in low income countries, over 30% in countries such as Haiti, Kenya, the Philippines, and Uganda. And that also brings us to the fourth myth, that it is the private sector to be blamed for privatization. In fact, most schools in low and middle income countries that are private have a single proprietor, and they emerged due to concerns about public school quality. Yet at the same time, there are also some myths about what is driving some of these trends. Parents do not, in fact, base their school choice decisions on information about quality as we would like to think that they do. For example, in Santiago, Chile, parental decisions were influenced by school demographics than academic reputation. It's about who they want their children to relate with, rather than necessarily checking and having the information to do so about the quality of the education provided. And also, the report questions the idea that competition leads to school improvement. competition does work in many spheres of life, but it may not work the same way in education. And what we also find is that non-state schools sometimes may pander to parental aspirations, for instance, offering them education in a language like other than the language they speak at home, because they have this aspiration for their children to enter a different part of life. The seventh myth is that private schools and universities are better. In fact, when we control for the fact that schools select students on the basis of wealth and academic performance, we find that the private school premium drops by 1/2 to 2/3. And we also know that private schools tend to benefit from more resources. A survey of teachers and head teachers around the world found that in lower secondary schools, the head teachers were twice as likely to report that they lacked technology for instruction or they lacked support personnel, more in public schools than in private schools. Of course, we know that private schools have also suffered in the current COVID context that has dominated our concerns over the last 2 years. The eighth myth is that the private sector is ready to help solve the out-of-school challenge. In fact, private schools mostly serve richer urban populations. In low and middle-income countries, the richest children, as this graph shows, are 10 times more likely to attend a private school than the poorest. And the related myth is that the private sector will help solve the education financing gap, an ambition and aspiration also expressed in the framework for action. In fact, the private sector could make a better contribution by paying fair tax. More tax is actually lost from evasion and avoidance than the aid received in developing countries. And also by supporting skills development more and offering more opportunities for childcare at the workplace. Finally, we place a lot of our hopes in good, effective regulation. The report has actually reviewed the regulatory approach to non-state providers in all the world's countries. You can find this resource at our peer website. And we find that there are actually lacking regulations in very important areas of system quality and equity, such as admissions, spending, tutoring. That leads the report to make 5 recommendations for establishing an enabling policy and regulatory environment built on standards, information, incentives, and accountability. The first recommendation reminds countries to fulfill their commitment to make 1 year of pre-primary and 12 years of primary and secondary education free. Publicly financed need not mean publicly provided, but governments must ensure the same conditions for all students. Government-funded schools should not charge fees. 67% of countries regulate non-state provider fees. Schools should not select students, and yet only 55% of countries prevent selective admissions. And there should be no profit-making in compulsory primary and secondary education. Only 27% of countries explicitly ban profit-making. The second recommendation is about establishing quality standards that apply to all state and non-state education institutions. Standards should cover not just inputs, but also processes and results. Teachers should be valued as professionals in all schools. Quality assurance mechanisms should monitor and enforce these standards. And private tutoring should not negatively affect system equity and quality. Only half of countries regulate private tutoring at the moment. And we should also apply common monitoring and support processes. Regulations are often impractical and do not protect the disadvantaged. Governments need to have a clear vision how to engage non-state actors, see them as partners, and be honest about the causes of the phenomena they try to regulate. We therefore need simple, transparent, and efficient regulations. In many sub-Saharan African countries, such as Kampala or Lagos, many schools do not register. The last 2 recommendations are related to ideas. It is very important for governments to help innovation spread through the education system. No one actor has monopoly on good ideas. But providers should also not try to outcompete each other in education. The government must ensure that good ideas and good practices are shared, tested, and adopted in all schools. And finally, we need to maintain the transparency and integrity of public education policy processes. We need to give all voices equal chance to be expressed and influence policy. And we need to monitor and safeguard against lobbying and revolving door practices. Before I close, let me also remind you that the Global Education Monitoring Report, of course, covers not only its theme, but routine monitoring of progress towards achieving SDG 4, a monitoring that actually has been hampered by very difficult conditions in terms of the data access that we have as a result of the pandemic. But a very important development that I would like to share with you is that we have made concrete progress, the Global Education Monitoring Reports with the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, to fulfill a commitment that was made in 2015 so that all countries have appropriate intermediate benchmarks. We have defined 7 benchmark indicators that then all countries were asked to contribute their target values. That means each country's contribution to the global education agenda, very much in the way that the climate change agenda has evolved with the national determined contributions. And therefore also make sure that we have a good way of linking national, regional, and global agendas. You can find these benchmarks at the Global Education Observatory website, and you can also find the developments on the completion rate, one of these 7 core indicators, at our new website called View at educationestimates.org. As of today, 40% of countries have submitted national benchmarks, 10% have committed to, another 15% have regional benchmarks. 2 in 3 countries in the world have specified how they are contributing to the global education agenda. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and we look forward to your reactions to the report using the hashtag #WriteTheRules. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manos. Well, I don't think anybody can be in any doubt now that these non-state actors are here playing a role in education and will continue to do so. So I think we're also very clear from the report that this does pose important questions for all of us about finance, about equity, about school admissions, about governance, innovation and influence, and how we can make this work for all young people in an equitable way. And as Manos has said, we're asking everybody to take part today by using the report's hashtag #WriteTheRules on social media and particularly on Twitter to answer the questions and to show how you are supporting progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals 4 in your activities. Now, I'm delighted to announce another 4 speakers with us today, each representing a key stakeholder in the global education system. And we're going to be hearing some of their responses to the report's core questions and to find out how they're working to write the rules and to build and strengthen effective education systems for everybody. First, we have David Senge with us this morning, the Minister of Basic and Senior Secondary Education and Chief Innovation Officer in Sierra Leone. David is also chair of the advisory board for the GEM report. He's joined by Colm Brophy, Minister of State for Overseas Development and Diaspora in Ireland, and Fabio Segura, who's co-chair of the OECD's Net Forward Group and co-CEO of the Jacobs Foundation. They'll all be joining us today online. But first of all, I'm going to turn to David, Minister Senge. And it seems that the theme of today's report resonates a lot with your life story, because you went to a non-state school and then a state secondary school in Sierra Leone. You continue to work through a world-class university, coming out as an academic at another, and then a research scientist at a big IT firm. And as Sierra Leone's education minister and first ever chief innovation officer, could you tell us something about how you channel these experiences into the way you govern the education sector in your country? And in particular, we're looking to you to answer the question about equity. The report calls for governments to pay greater attention to their commitment to provide 12 years of free quality education across state and non-state providers. facing up to the reality that public education in low-income countries has many hidden costs. How have you sought to monitor out-of-pocket education spending and develop policies that target resources at disadvantaged learners in your area?
Thank you very much for the question, and thank you to UNESCO for hosting the GEM report, and for Manos for that excellent presentation. Yes, my background is a bit of a mix of everything. Went to private primary school, public secondary school, and got a scholarship to private institutions thereafter. And I never really have seen the need to have a dichotomy between public and private in this way, in part because I was anyway funded with scholarships in my private education. But you see, in Sierra Leone, we believe that the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Goal 4 is crystal clear: inclusive and equitable education and promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all. One critical goal in ensuring that all children can benefit from a minimum of 12 years of basic education. And that cannot be done solely by the state. We need non-state actors, including missions, NGOs, civil society, and community-based organizations, and yes, the private sector, to guarantee this goal. And this has been driven explicitly clear. In Sierra Leone, His Excellency President Julius Maada Bio launched the Free Quality School Education Initiative, providing tuition-free access to public education for any Sierra Leonean, including 1 year of pre-primary education and 12 years of primary and secondary education. Government also provides core textbooks, teaching and learning materials, school feeding, transition examination fees, and more. Through this, government has increased public sector spending on education to about 22% of its national budget. And we've seen about 34% more children who've enrolled in schools, mostly in pre-primary and senior secondary school, since that policy change in 2018. Sierra Leone is one of a few countries, in fact, to have expanded its education budget during the COVID global crisis. But that is not enough. A recent study, which was published in November, just this year, 2021, through a collaboration with the Institute of Global Reform in Sierra Leone, showed that out-of-pocket education spending by families is significant. We wanted to know the cost and burden of education to families that was complementary to what government was doing. So we engaged an independent organization to do that monitoring for us. The study found that government spends about 48% of the total cost of education in 2020. The 52% was spent by families, household financing. And if you look at household financing for public school education, that was about 39% of the overall cost of education. And household financing of private school education represented about 13% of the overall cost of education. Parents are spending more on uniforms, school bags, and non-core textbooks. And an area that is a challenge is that corruption in education is also a burden on parents, because even where we say parents should not pay tuition, schools and some schools and authorities find ways to get money and resources from parents. These are all huge challenges that limit access to education. These numbers vary across regions within Sierra Leone, as we found, and there's significant gaps between the urban and rural areas. Education is not equitable for girls, the poor, and those in remote rural areas are often being left behind. This is why one of the policy changes that we've done in response to this is what we call radical inclusion. A radical inclusion is a policy that we launched with governments and partners that essentially says we'll stop at nothing until everyone can go to school. It underpins our goals and objectives towards the SDG 4 targets. But I think the one thing that remains clear is we will not be able to achieve the 2030 goals if we assume or pretend that government and state actors are the only ones who have a responsibility, or the only ones who should be playing a role, or that their role is somehow more important than everybody's roles. We need all these other attributes, all these other players, including private sector, including civil society organizations, and parents and families. And we need to recognize and celebrate the contributions and the sacrifices that those parents and families are playing, the role that they are playing or not playing, or where they can continue to support and enhance government and these public sector institutions to ensure that indeed all children can access and stay in school.
Thank you, David. That was really, really inspiring to hear about everything that you're doing in Sierra Leone in this area to address the issues. Now, I'm going to turn to Minister Brophy to ask a question about influence. Colm, Brophy, are you there? Yeah.
I am indeed.
A lot has been written about the growing role of the private sector in development cooperation, with some donors opting to support the development of the private sector in education in developing countries. So my question to you really is, what should donors do to ensure that their support to private sector initiatives leaves no one behind? And what safeguards need to be put in place to ensure that all actions are driving towards the same agenda of inclusive and equitable quality education for all?
Right. Well, firstly, thanks obviously for the opportunity to participate today, and just to congratulate Manos and to the whole GEM report team on producing a really quality and very relevant report. As people will be aware, Ireland is very proud to be a long-term supporter of your work. I think that it's an excellent report. It examines the evidence, I believe, and dispels some of the myths about state and non-state actors in education. And while doing that, it's type of looking at it in a nuanced discussion, looking at the decision making. So, to go to your question, we're reminded that states have responsibility, I think, to protect and fulfil the right to education. That's the very first thing. It doesn't mean, though, from my perspective, that governments can deliver every aspect of education. There is a role for both non-state actors in education, and the report clearly describes that, and the different roles they play. Now, having said that, we should be making it very clear that we would be doing a real disservice, I believe, to children and young people if the focus of education was ever to shift from the academic and social development of children to in any way a profit-making model. I think that would be completely wrong. We also believe that we should prevent the stratification or the segregation of learners, and instead we should have education systems that promote not just academic excellence, which is really important, but also social cohesion. And we have seen that in a number of cases, including in Ireland. And there is a real need to have that balance between the academic and social cohesion. So the state and the non-state provision of education needs to be, I believe, part of the one system. So as donors, we have a responsibility, I believe, to ensure that education upholds the national policies and priorities. It adheres, obviously, to the international agreements. We do that, though, not just in terms of our support for the state side, but also for non-state providers. And we need to make sure that we're basing it on things I've outlined earlier. We need to keep things like inclusion, equity, equality, very much to the forefront in making our decisions about who we fund and what we fund. In terms of how Ireland approaches it, our commitment is obviously to leaving no one behind and obviously reaching the furthest behind first. So in terms of funding in our work and what people do with the funding we receive, it must reflect that. And what Irish Aid has been doing, we support the provision of education, as I said, both through the non-state side and the state side. We want to really focus a lot of our efforts on ensuring, as I said, things around equity, ensuring things around quality, but particularly for us, and particularly in the last year and a half, as not just as a result of COVID, but of the way things are going, putting a particular emphasis on children that have been affected by emergencies like COVID, by conflict. We will support non-state actors who are reaching those who are furthest behind affected by those emergencies. We want to put a particular aspect and responsibility on governments They need to have, I believe, the capacity to apply quality standards, to do things like ensure adherence to health and safety standards in and around education. Governments in countries must enforce those standards for themselves and for the non-state actors. One of the very worrying things, going back to the point I was making about COVID, is we have really seen, I believe, a huge impact on education as a result of COVID. And particularly that education has affected in the gender equality area, which Ireland is a really strong supporter of, and a disproportionate impact on girls' education. And we must work to ensure that both on the state and the non-state side, that we focus on that area. So I'd like to thank you very much again for the opportunity to participate. I believe it's a very interesting discussion. I also think that we will have discussions as well in the future around areas like the technology offerings that are available out there that have come to the fore over the COVID period. There's a lot of interest, I think, in seeing how they can be or will they be effective? Are they a good value for money solution in terms of, and I know that's part of the work that will make up your 2023 report. So I look forward to seeing that as well. So that's just a brief answer, hopefully, to your question. Thank you again.
Thank you, Minister Brophy. Now we're going to move to the area of regulation to hear from the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to education and the former Minister for Education and Literacy of Burkina Faso, Dr. Koumba Boly Barry. Now, Dr. Barry, through your mandate, you have called on governments to uphold the right to education, and you've also written extensively on the realisation of the right to education in the context of the growth of the private sector. And you also championed the drafting and the subsequent adoption in February 2019 of the Abidjan Principles on the human rights obligations of states to provide public education and to regulate private involvement in education. Our question for you is, can you tell us some of the concrete solutions laid out in the principles and how these can be considered as a guiding tool to support the report's third recommendation on ensuring effective regulations that apply to all state and non-state institutions? Thank you.
Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, en vos titres, grades et rangs respectifs, je voudrais remercier l'UNESCO et toute son équipe pour ce travail extraordinaire et surtout pour avoir choisi cette thématique qui fait objet de grandes controverses aujourd'hui au niveau des débats. Et il faut reconnaître aussi que cette thématique qui a été choisie, non seulement elle fait des débats, mais aussi elle est cette thématique est très pertinente pour l'effectivité du droit à l'éducation. Donc, je voudrais vraiment remercier encore une fois et saluer l'équipe de l'UNESCO pour ce travail qui a été un travail surtout aussi fouillé et utile au monde de l'éducation. Par rapport à la question qui m'a été posée, je voudrais dire que comme d'autres rapporteurs spéciaux sur le droit à l'éducation avant moi, je me suis récemment encore inquiétée de la privatisation grandissante des systèmes éducatifs et de son impact négatif sur la réalisation du droit à l'éducation. Il faut reconnaître que c'est pour ça que les principes d'Abidjan viennent comme une sorte un peu d'outils, d'instruments, mais aussi de méthodes, mais mieux, d'approches philosophiques aussi pour aider et guider les États, mais aussi l'ensemble des autres acteurs pour s'assurer que l'implication du secteur privé dans l'éducation et dans l'effectivité particulièrement du droit à l'éducation fonctionne. Je m'en vais pour preuve que les principes d'Abidjan, dans un premier temps, respectent et interpellent les États pour qu'ils respectent, bien sûr, l'éducation d'abord publique, gratuite, de qualité et inclusive. C'est d'abord ça la ligne en ce qui concerne les principes d'Abidjan. Le deuxième élément important, c'est justement de donner des éléments qui encadrent l'intervention du secteur privé. Les principes d'Abidjan reconnaissent les écoles privées et les acteurs privés. Mais les principes d'Abidjan disent non à la marchandisation de l'éducation, et ça a été d'ailleurs une grande posture pour beaucoup d'autres rapporteurs spéciaux qui s'inquiètent de plus en plus de cette privatisation et cette marchandisation des biens sociaux au niveau mondial. Et je crois que c'est une inquiétude partagée et je pense que c'est une ligne rouge de plus en plus qu'il ne faut pas vraiment dépasser. Et je crois que c'est vraiment important que l'UNESCO prenne en charge cette question-là et très fortement.
And now I'm going to move on to Fabio Segura, who's the co-chair of the Network of Foundations Working for Development, NetForward, and the co-CEO of the Jacobs Foundation, to reflect on the meaningful roles that the philanthropic foundations can play in education systems at a local, national, regional, and global level. Now, this sort of funding is on the rise with an average of about $700 million per year. Education was the second most supported sector by foundations after health, but delivering innovation is a complex task for a public education system, which may be leaning on the conservative side for good or bad reasons. And the challenges can include bureaucratic obstacles, organizational capacity, limited means, and political meddling and opposition. So how are foundations placed to influence and support reform? What is their role? How do they gain legitimacy? And how can foundations' investments help move the needle in education and nurture innovation in the public education system in the process? Fabio, over to you.
Thank you, Fiona. And again, allow me to add my voice to the congratulations to the GEM report team for this incredible milestone, debunking some of the myths that are that exist in public and private education and giving us a better understanding of the current state of education funding and provision worldwide. As you have mentioned, foundations and philanthropic funding in education is only a fraction of the total expenditures. And therefore, our ambition and our role is limited if we see it as a provider of education at scale. In that sector, as has also been mentioned today, we have the primary role of the state and a growing role of the private sector and families. But both of them, as has also been mentioned today, have barriers to deliver on the promise of education because they are subject to the dynamics of politics and policy and to the dynamics of markets. But there are 4 things where foundations are particularly well positioned to add value in this context. Number 1 is to generate valuable and valid evidence for what works in terms of delivering on the benefits of education, from increasing learning outcomes to increasing social cohesion or delivering on 21st century skills. The careful design of interventions and models with a view to rigorously provide a basis for evidence and scientific research could be one of the added values that foundations can avail to the stakeholders scaling these models broadly in the different systems. A second one is because foundations are relatively independent actors in the different contexts, they can help broker trust and knowledge between the different stakeholders and therefore innovate in partnerships and therefore also leverage capacities and resources to scale up evidence base and effective practices. A third role that I see foundations being well positioned to play is to act as catalytic investors. And by that, I mean to use a broad range of instruments, financial instruments that would de-risk either the public sector's funding or the private sector funding into availing capital that otherwise wouldn't be on the table to pursue more effective or innovative ways of proceeding with the education provision. And then the last one is identifying windows of opportunity in policymaking, in the policymaking cycle, to support policymakers in introducing evidence-based instruments for policy, new approaches and new leadership approaches to managing education policy. Now, with this, my take here is that foundations basically have a very strong potential added value if they focus as much on how they work and who they work with than on where they work and how much they're funding. With this, I thank again the GEM report for the incredible contribution to our debate at the international arena. And I pass it right back to you, Fiona.
Well, first of all, thank all of you for taking part. It's been very, very interesting for me and very thought-provoking, actually, to see all these issues set in a global context and think more clearly about the sort of issues we should all be thinking about if we're going to bring equity across the world. And I think one of the things that's really come out from today is the particular challenges that the pandemic have left everybody who cares about education and equality with. So this report could not come at a more opportune moment to remind us that we are all responsible for upholding the right to education, but also that we all have a role to play in ensuring equity and inclusion for all learners become a reality. So just a reminder of the key issues, I think, in the questions, which are about equity, about quality, about innovation, about regulation, and to understand that, you know, it's a reality that non-state actors do play a part in the delivery of education, but we've got to ensure that that happens in a way that is fair to everybody, and to share best practice and expertise. And the important thing about today is that hopefully these findings and recommendations will be spread more widely, and that will particularly happen if you follow the hashtag Right to Rules, keep abreast of all the activities in your region or country, and also post about what you're doing. So can I just say one more time, thank you to all of our speakers, and have a wonderful afternoon, and good luck with everything that you're doing on behalf of all of our children. Thank you. Goodbye.
From the moment a child is born, their journey in education is shaped by many factors: their dreams, their values, the means of their family. The 2021 and 2022 Global Education Monitoring Report explores how an incredibly diverse set of actors, in addition to government, influences education pathways. From the start, toddlers may go to private daycare. If public schools are scarce or of low quality or do not respond to their needs, families may seek an alternative. Decisions over how they get to school, what school meals they eat, what textbooks they study, which extracurricular activities they participate in, may all involve non-state actors. Later on, they may attend a private university. As adults, they will rely on their employers for their training. But the question of who should provide education incites passionate debate. Are non-state actors effective? Are they efficient? Are they innovative? Whatever the answers to these questions may be, solutions such as regulations must have inclusion and equity at their core. Governments made a promise to provide 12 years of free primary and secondary education. Families, especially in poor countries, spend too much of their income educating their children, even when their children go to public school. Education should be truly free. But publicly funded does not mean publicly provided. It is vital governments treat all actors as one. No school should apply admission procedures that discriminate against disadvantaged students. No disparity in teacher working conditions by type of school should be tolerated. No differences in quality standards and monitoring should exist. This even-handed approach also means supporting all actors the same way. Governments must embrace an education vision of equity, inclusion, and quality for all children, whatever school they attend. And everyone's view should count to generate new insights for education. Nobody has the monopoly to good ideas, and these ideas should reach all schools. It's time to write the rules. Make sure education systems are built to fulfill the right of all children to education, not just of a lucky few.